everybody, and welcome to our event today. Today's knowledge exchange is presented by us, the Center for Excellence in Interprofessional Education and Practice, and also by Project Safe Neighborhood that you will be hearing from today, and we're very excited to have them here. We are aware that today's knowledge exchange will explore the experiences and impacts of gun violence from multiple perspectives. We know that this is a complex, emotional, and often divisive topic, and for some, highly personal, and we will hear about that today as well. UNE counseling services, the information is available, and folks are available here today if you should need them. Our hope for this event today is that as future health providers, educators, advocates, citizens, whatever disciplines you work with, that you will engage with learning from our panelists and also from each other, and we will learn from you. We encourage you to ask thoughtful questions, engage in meaningful conversation that advances the prevention of gun violence in our communities, and provides critical insight that assists you to help the people who become your patients, your clients, and others you will be working with in the future. So it is now my absolute pleasure to introduce Darcie McElwee. Darcie currently serves as the United States Attorney for the District of Maine. She was nominated by President Biden in August 2021 and confirmed by the U.S. Senate in October 2021. Darcie also serves as the First Circuit representative on the 12 Maine U.S. Attorney Committee that advises Attorney General Merrick Garland. Darcie previously worked as an Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Maine out of the Portland office, where she primarily prosecuted violent crime such as robbery, arson, firearms cases involving domestic violence, interstate domestic violence, stalking, and sex trafficking issues. And we have other experts here in those areas. For over 15 years, she's coordinated Maine's Project Safe Neighborhoods program, which involved engaging in community outreach regarding the prevention of violence and illegal gun possession. Darcie is a native Mainer and a graduate of Bowdoin College and the University of Maine Law School. And I'm so happy to introduce you today, Darcie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shelley. And thank you everyone for participating in this event today. On behalf of the U.S. Attorney's Office and the entire Department of Justice, I'm thrilled to welcome all of you. And thank you for your interest and participation and your partnership as community members as we work to engage with all of our members of Maine's community on the critical and complicated issue related to gun violence. As students with hopes and plans of entering the healthcare profession, as well as members of a beautiful local campus here in Maine, my hope is that you will come away from this presentation today with a better understanding of how to professionally best assist those traumatized by violence, as well as personally keep yourselves safe from the same experiences. We are excited by this partnership with UNE, thrilled to introduce you to two outstanding and knowledgeable presenters today, and grateful for your time and attention. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to the new Project Safe Neighborhoods Coordinator in my office, Assistant United States Attorney Johnathan.
Thank you, Darcie. I appreciate you all having us here today. My name is Johnathan Nathans. I'm an Assistant United States Attorney here in the District of Maine, and as Darcie said, the Project Safe Neighborhoods Coordinator. It's my pleasure today to introduce both of our speakers to you. The first is Chief Timothy Longo Sr. Timothy Longo Sr. was appointed the University of Virginia's Associate Vice President for Safety and Security and Chief of Police in November 2019. He brings more than 40 years of experience in law enforcement and leadership and higher education in his role. Chief Longo began his police career at the Baltimore Police Department in June 1981, rising to the level of Police Colonel and Chief of Technical Services. During his years with the department, he wore many hats, such as Commanding Officer of the Special Investigation Section with the Internal Investigation Division, Director of Emergency Communications Division, and Chief of Staff to the Police Commissioner. He retired from the Baltimore Police Department in March of 2000. Chief Longo next worked briefly in consultation in DC for a private firm where he oversaw an audit of major law enforcement departments around the country. During his next chapter as Chief of Police in Charlottesville, Virginia, Chief Longo was responsible for providing leadership over several high-profile investigations that impacted the University of Virginia community. The murder of student athlete Yardley Love, the disappearance of murder of second-year student Hannah Graham, and the investigation into allegations of sexual assault stemming from a 2014 article in the Rolling Stone magazine. In 2016, after more than 15 years, Chief Longo retired from the Charlottesville PD and joined the faculty of University of Virginia's School of Continuing and Professional Studies to create a master's degree in public safety that addresses issues as the challenges of 21st century policing and the evolving role of law enforcement in serving the communities they protect. The program was approved by the Virginia State Council on Higher Education. Chief Longo also serves as an adjunct faculty member at the law school, and in addition to his primary law enforcement and educational endeavors, he has served as part of a team of independent monitors appointed to conduct police department oversight on behalf of federal courts in 3 cities across America. In addition to these responsibilities, he has served as police practice expert on behalf of both plaintiffs and defendants in a variety of legal matters in state and federal courts pertaining to law enforcement practices. Now turning to Pardeep Kaleka, is the author of The Gift of Our Wounds. He's also the co-director of Not in Our Town, a de-radicalization specialist with Parents for Peace, a columnist with the Milwaukee Independent, a trauma clinician, and adjunct professor of peace studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And with that, we're going to turn this conversation over to Chief Longo. Thank you very much.
John, thanks so much. And good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to have a conversation with us. And I hope that this is exactly what it will be, a conversation. I appreciate always sharing my background with individuals so that they have at least an understanding that kind of what comes out of my mouth comes from my heart and from my experience. But I guess first and foremost, I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a grandfather. I'm somebody who's feels very deeply about this profession, where it's been, where it is, where it's going, and how it impacts violent crime, police violence included, quite frankly, and also how it impacts communities. You know, I grew up in a city that has violent crimes run rampant my whole life. I learned policing in a city where we saw 300 murders a year, hundreds of shootings. We had Johns Hopkins on the east and shock trauma on the west, and it's because of the skilled hands and minds and hearts of medical professionals that we didn't have more murders in that city. I watched the city deteriorate in the aftermath of crack cocaine when it hit the streets of Baltimore in the 80s. I saw it impact young people and old people. We made terrible mistakes as a law enforcement community in trying to control that. But nonetheless, it became a task that was focused on keeping people from being killed. And the drug markets were just a byproduct of that. I came to Charlottesville in 2001 as its police chief. And I got to tell you, most of the stuff that I saw when I got here wasn't in the hiring brochure. You know, I thought I was moving to this idyllic community, something you read about in a storybook. If you ever watched the Waltons growing up, Walton's Mountain, the fictional Walton's Mountain is portrayed just 15 miles from where I sit right now. I didn't expect that I would come here and I would see even a portion of what I saw on the streets of Baltimore City. But here's what I learned pretty quickly. And here's what you'll learn if you don't already know it, regardless of where you might land in some city across America, in a hospital or a trauma center or an ambulatory clinic or a doc's office. Violence is everywhere in our community. It's Charlottesville is a microcosm of much larger cities across the nation. I would venture to say that most cities are microcosms of these larger cities that we hear about every night on the evening news. You know, one of the things that really made this so apparent to me that we saw here and that maybe you see in your community is I got a call one night for a shooting on a street in the city on Rougemont Avenue. It's a very small street. It's about 590 feet from one stop sign to the next. And there was a gun battle that took place there, 11, 12 o'clock at night. And 50 plus shell casings were scattered across those 500 feet of real estate. 10 residential homes were struck by gunfire. One woman was blinded. She lived, but to this day, she's without sight. Many others were almost hit. Many of them were children. By the grace of God, first, and good fortune, second, they weren't hit by a bullet, or they wouldn't be here today. And so in the aftermath of that event, I asked one of my police lieutenants to tell me best he could the various criminal enterprises that existed in this 10.7 square mile city of less than 50,000 people. And what we identified then there, and what I would argue is largely responsible for much of the violence we see in our communities today, were loosely organized criminal street gangs that grew up in neighborhoods, that got involved in criminal activity, that developed a relationship and a pact where their focus and their effort was around violence. A lot of that violence was related to drug activity. We saw 5 or 6 criminal street gangs in the city of Charlottesville, and that was my first introduction and relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Charlottesville. And we used the powers of the federal court, the federal grand jury, and the federal statutes to identify those groups engaged in violence, not just drug sales, but violent crime, murders, shootings, aggravated assaults, robberies, and we brought them to court. Dozens upon dozens of people were taken off our streets. But you know what? It only helped for a while. Other groups stood up and they engaged in very similar activity. And each day we struggle with that as a community, and that activity goes up and down. I want to pause for a moment here and turn to a very recent event that further underscored and was a reminder to me that I too live in a city that could find itself in a position of being the victim of violent crime. November the 13th, 2022, that was a Sunday morning. 20 students at the University of Virginia, all of whom knew each other, some better than others, but all knew each other, all had a relationship of some sort with each other. They got on a bus with a faculty member who very graciously and heartfully, I might add, organized a field trip to a wonderful play in Washington, D.C., which is about 110 miles north of Charlottesville. And this group traveled to that play and they spent an entire day together. They broke bread together. They likely laughed together. They certainly enjoyed each other's company to some respect, some more than others. And then they traveled home at the end of the day. And they got here about 10 o'clock in the evening. And that bus that they were on, very large bus, was a tour bus for just these 20 people because they couldn't find another vehicle or mode of transportation smaller than that. When that bus arrived here, one of those students stood up unexpectedly, took a gun from his belongings that no one knew was there, pointed it at the first person, who was an athlete, who he knew, and he shot and killed him. And then almost immediately thereafter, shot and killed 2 others and wounded yet 2 more. Got off the bus and fled and sent shockwaves throughout the entire community. Locked down one of the most notable universities in our nation. For whatever reason you choose, people know the University of Virginia. Many have visited the University of Virginia. No one ever would have thought something like this would have happened on the grounds of the University of Virginia, and certainly not with people who knew each other and have relationships with each other. And it happened nonetheless. And fortunately, several hours later, some 12 hours later or so, this student, and he was a student who was almost immediately identified, was taken into custody and arrested. But the reality of it is that the lives of an entire university community and parents, some that were thousands of miles away, for a period of time was absolutely deconstructed. And that deconstruction remains until today. Every piece of this university, including our medical center, was impacted by that event and continues to be impacted by that event. From that tragic, horrific, unthinkable incident, our president of the university, Jim Ryan, together with our community, decided to get together and form a working group of citizens. If you can think of the constituency that would be involved in that working group, you'd probably be right. There were academics, there were social scientists, there were people representing a host of advocacy groups, there were prosecutors, there were law enforcement officers, there were school principals, high school principals, and university officials. There was a representative from what I call violence interruption group, a group of citizens, many of which have spent time in prison, had previously in life led a life of crime, went to jail, went to prison, fulfilled their sentence, and came out different, came out wanting to do something positive, and came together to learn about how to be that source of influence that can go into a neighborhood that's not law enforcement, by the way, to interrupt violence. And those voices were at this table too. And from that president's working group, we met at least 12 times, came a series of recommendations that have not yet been made public. I'm going to give you a glimpse of what those recommendations are, because I think they have applicability to where you live. And I think they have applicability to your space as well. I think they have applicability to any community across this country because they're so holistic and they touch so many different types of constituents. There were folks from our medical center that were part of this task force as well. And one of the recommendations they came up with, and I think it's almost a common sense one, was to create a protective environment for our community. And that's not just law enforcement. That's educating, that's building effective constitutional and relational public safety service. Policing is a balance between the government's interest and the humans and the individual's interest. But in the middle of all that isn't just the law, it's what the community expects of the public safety apparatus. And so this first recommendation is you need to do that better. You need to do that more collaboratively. You need to do that in a way that's not just policing, but it's citizenry and it's community as well. Second recommendation was to enhance what they refer to as place-based programming and access to care. Another way to say that is invest more wisely in your community. Recognize that gun violence is not just a crime problem. It's not just a criminal justice problem. It's not just Timmy's problem and John's problem and Darcie's problem, Pardeep's problem. It's the medical center's problem. It's the trauma surgeon's problem. It's the trauma nurse's problem. It's the mental health provider's problem. It's a community problem. And if you're going to invest your money in reducing gun violence, invest it where it'll have the most longevity, the most sustainability, the most impact. Enhance place-based community resources that go way beyond traditional criminal justice process. The third, and I think equally important recommendation was to improve the coordination of service providers. Every community has a host of resources that focus on fixing these problems that we're talking about, quite frankly. Yet more often than not, and maybe because they're competing for the same pot of money, they compete against each other as opposed to working with each other. And so figuring a way of leveraging that in a positive way that divides the resources financially that are available to these groups in such a way that they will have the most impact in the community. One of the things I love about Project Safe Neighborhoods today, and certainly John and Darcie know far more about this than I will ever know, is when that program started, it focused on guns and violent crime and gang activity. It's so much broader now. It has a community engagement piece that's so robust that not only invites, but helps create, and I hope plug for myself, hopefully fund these kinds of programs where we've leveraged all the resources we have in the community, including mental health and medicine, to help develop long-term and sustainable programs and resources that really get to the heart of gun violence, not just the Band-Aid approach, but get to the heart and the cause of what causes people to engage in violent crime. And then the last thing that we recommended this task force, this large group, was finding a way, more effective way, I might add, to connect young people, because here's what we're finding in Charlottesville today. Maybe it's like this in your neighborhood. A lot of the people with a gun in their hand committing crime is 16, 18 years old. Some of them is younger than that. How do you connect with that young person before they make that gun or no gun decision? Sometimes they make it by the time they're 10 years old, quite frankly. I've seen in my experience. It wasn't unusual in Balmer to find a 12 and 14-year-old with a handgun. How do you connect that young person with caring adults and meaningful activities young enough in their life to where they'll sustain that relationship over time and turn away from whatever might have drawn them to the possession of that firearm? I'm hopeful, and I think our president is hopeful, that these recommendations will find their way into programming for this community and get to the heart of what we're here to talk about today with gun violence. I want to be respectful to Pardeep and others, but I want to talk a little bit about importance of training in conversation. And I'll talk particularly and specifically to our healthcare providers and educators that are in the room, or soon to be healthcare providers and educators that might be in the room. How much conversation do we have in the workplace about violence? I don't have to tell you how many active shooters have found their way into emergency departments, labor and delivery units, mother-baby units, critical care units, administrative sectors of hospitals and medical center campuses. I don't need to tell you how frequently that has been reported out in our media. Even though in the grand scheme of violent crime, those events are small, they get a lot of traction in the media. They're talked about a lot. They send lots of signals of concern to people who work in those environments. If you don't have a program, a presentation, a training block that talks to you about violent crime in the community where you work and where you live, that talks to you about what to do when you're in the midst of a violent attacker, that talks about the protocols that are in place to alert a large campus setting, how to react, what to do and what not to do. If you don't have that in place, if that's not a regular part of the discussion that's happening in the workplace and in the educational environment, you're absolutely way behind the curve. And I encourage not just this group, but other groups I talk to almost every day to start paying attention to that level of training as part of this conversation. We have to work through gun violence as a society. But meanwhile, we also have to acknowledge we live in an evil world, and evil looks just like me and you. And it reacts in ways that will deconstruct people's lives. And sometimes you, just like that Sunday evening on November 13th, nobody saw that coming, but it came, and it's impacted people's lives forever. So are we having that conversation about the realities of the spaces that we come every day and where we live? Because again, it can happen anywhere. I'm going to stop there and welcome the opportunity for conversation in the chat rooms. Welcome the opportunity for conversation even after this call, if I can be helpful to you. And then I'll turn it back to the moderator to introduce our next speaker.
Chief, one thing that I think might be worth addressing at this point is you were talking about sort of developing training blocks for the healthcare professionals. Is part of that training, or are you aware of any training related to how to deal with the aftermath of one of these mass shooting events, and sort of the importance of not just how to prevent, but also how to react in the aftermath of one of these events? And maybe talk briefly just about how your community dealt with the aftermath after the November 22 event at your university.
Yeah, John, thank you. And I apologize if I glossed over or skipped over that. I certainly didn't intend to do so. You know, every institution big or small, has a critical incident management team. Again, if you don't, it's something that I strongly advise you to begin to bring together, because that team, which usually are key resources throughout any institution, an academic institution, a medical institution, a private institution, is a team of a cross-section of leadership that comes together that not only helps to prepare and exercise that preparedness throughout the year with tabletop exercises and functional exercises, it also exercises the recovery phase, which is part of the emergency management process. There's a preparedness phase, there's a mitigation phase, there's an execution phase, and there's a recovery phase. And oftentimes that recovery involves mental health providers. It provides, oftentimes calls for spiritual resources, religious resources, other types of emotional support resources that are brought together in the aftermath to help students, faculty, staff, providers, community begin to understand what happened in their space, and to provide opportunities for one-on-one discussion, group discussion. You know, in the aftermath of November 13, we reached out to faculty and employee providers, assistance providers, mental health providers from all over our region. We reached out to resources in the Department of Criminal Justice Services to provide mental health support for our students. And we pre-identified space on grounds to do that work. The other thing we did was we brought in emotional support animals, service dogs. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised how receptive not just students, but members of the community were when we brought those dogs into the space to give comfort and kind of restore a sense of reality that, you know, I hate to say it this way, but things are going to be okay. We're going to somehow get through this together, and we're going to work hard to accomplish that task. The other thing that is part of that restoration or recovery stage is what we call a family unification piece. You know, oftentimes in these events, particularly where there's a lockdown, the people that are either just around the corner or 1,000 miles away are worried about their loved one who's that trauma surgeon that might have been in the OR that day, or that nurse who might have been in mother, baby, or labor and delivery, engaged in their work in the midst of when this happened, and they're not hearing from them because they can't, or they don't have the access or ability to have that communication. When the smoke clears and the scene is secure and the event has been stabilized, the ability to bring those families back together into a common safe space is extraordinarily important. And it's not just a room with a roof and food that's lined up along the table, along the wall on a table. It's that mental health support and that social service support, and sometimes that housing support, whether it be lining up a housing for a day or a week, that are part of that that script of resources, if you will, that are part of family unification. That's a snapshot, John. I don't know if that's responsive to your question. I could go on forever. And what I'm happy to do offline is anyone who is in a position to want to learn more about a CIMT process and how we deal with the aftermath of something like this in a very structured way, I'm happy to share that process with them. It's extraordinarily detailed, but it's also extraordinarily important. And quite frankly, it's labor intensive. One thing I'll mention, then I'll shut up as well, to keep in mind is when you're in the midst of a situation like this, particularly a lockdown, you have students and faculty and staff and patients that also have medical needs and just day-to-day nutrition needs. How you get those resources to those people that are locked down is really important. And oftentimes that means sending people into harm's way to accomplish that, particularly if you're in a lockdown situation where you don't know where the threat is. Unless you've thought about how you would accomplish that, then you do it in real time under circumstances that are oftentimes adverse. So having that as part of your planning process is really important too.
So we have some amazing questions in the chat. I know we're going to breakout session in 1 minute, but I want to promise Emily and Dominique and Brooke and others who have put questions in the chat that we will get to them. And we'll have an open Q&A in a little bit. And Tim, if you don't mind taking a look at the chat at some point, you may be able to respond to some of those students as well. But we are going to, before we get to Pardeep, who has a very powerful story to tell, we're going to do a quick breakout session. What we'd like you to do here is to introduce yourselves. Some of you have been to our events, so you know the drill. So we know who's in the room. And to talk a little bit about what was unexpected that you've learned, or something that is empowering or powerful for you to learn. And to think about your role as a health provider or any other discipline, and what your role is in addressing gun violence. We, as always, are asking that there be a note taker because we really want to hear from you in the chat after the breakout. And make sure you keep your video on because we love to see who's in the room. And finally, if you don't have a facilitator in your room, we're asking if someone is willing to help keep the conversation going. So let's get into our breakout rooms and have a powerful conversation and come back. Phenomenal. Great conversation about, really hadn't given a lot of thought yet to the meaning and connectivity of gun violence, specifically in health and in the health sphere. A lot of talk about needing to have some concrete ways to address it with patients and clients and with each other. Here we've got one. I've got to make my screen larger here. Can't really see some of the chat here, but wow, a lot of chat is coming in. So this is from Emily Wagner. We had not fully considered the aftermath of effects of violence. The stories focus on the immediate aftermath, the importance of community-based resources. And we heard that in our group too. And I want to thank Sarah for mentioning the importance of mental health and physical health coming together and thinking about the intersectionality of that. So that was really powerful, but really a yearning for, tell us what to do, tell us how to think. We need more knowledge, we need more training. Other groups, I'm going to be quiet now. What did other people hear?
Yeah, group 5, I think we had a really robust conversation about how there's not enough conversation being had about violent crime. And that part of that is sort of buying into the mentality of it hasn't happened here and isn't going to happen here. I think, which is a lot of what the chief was getting at in his talk on the first go round. I think there was also just talking about from sort of the healthcare professional realm of why those conversations, are not being had, with patients. Is sometimes I think there's this idea that if we're asking people whether or not that they have access to guns, that it's creating maybe a bit of conflict between the healthcare provider and the patient, and they're there to really sort of work on treating people and not creating an adversarial relationship where they are unnecessarily probing into people's personal lives, even though the healthcare professionals are really just trying to look out for people who might be in some sort of mental health crisis, and then also have access to firearms, which could be a recipe for a bad incident.
Heather Putnam, would you like to share what was you had something great to say in the chat?
Yes, of course. We had a breakout that I think was primarily, if not exclusively, medical students. And we each shared and talked through a number of components of if there is an incident. And that included the importance of sort of being present and listening to that individual in the ER, the importance of each, whether it's a surgeon as opposed to maybe the primary care physician, whatever the role is connecting with them, but respecting that maybe that primary care provider can play a bigger role in what resources and supports are needed. Another really important piece was that for an individual, if you connect with them and they've experienced victimization, to really listen and understand the context of how best to meet their needs or what they feel most comfortable with. And that may be outside of the criminal justice system entirely. And we spoke to how that really has become a critical piece as we move into providing supports and services, that we need to be sensitive to what feels safest for someone who's been victimized.
Thank you, Heather. I think Hannah had a great comment here. We discussed the ethical responsibilities we all have, not only as physicians and health providers for our patients, but as community members and to ourselves and our colleagues during emergency situations. It's, just looking at the multiple roles we play as health providers, carers, parents. I heard a lot from parents. There's a lot we can be thinking about and doing with and for each other and supporting one another. That was, I think, great conversation. And again, we've got a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts in the chat, which we can come back to. So thank you all very, very much. And I think we can now maybe turn to Pardeep.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Thank you so much for everyone just being so open during those conversations. I'm very lucky that I get to share kind of what my group was talking about. And this is the work that we do. I think I heard a lot of people say there's a term for this as well, so you can have this in your vocabulary. But kind of having a whole of society approach to prevent targeted violence or mass casualty violence or hate violence, also using a whole of society approach to utilize in the aftermath of it. And our group kind of laid out, some of this of what, the personal impact of trauma and how things that are happening around the world or maybe in their neighborhood affect them. Gun violence as it relates to survivors, thinking about active shooting and just the role of our own personal mental health needs to be centered as well. I want to share a video that we often share. In 2012, my father and 6 others were murdered by an affiliated white supremacist in the city of Oak Creek, Wisconsin. At that time, this was one of the deadliest hate crimes committed in nearly 50 years by an affiliated white supremacist at a place of worship. And sadly to say, over the years, this type of crime has escalated. And we, during that time, we kind of found out through just the compassion of the community of what we can do well and what we needed improvement in. So I appreciate the chief. Just I think sometimes, everything can seem theoretical. And I think this is what I heard from the students as well. And this time, you're at a university, it should be theoretical. And hopefully nobody's personally impacted by some of this at this time. But when it becomes real, right, you like that practice becomes practical, right? And you see what you're made of, and you see who you are. But also at the same time, you need to make sure that you take care of yourself. As this video is playing, please take care of yourself and know these are people who were impacted by a hate crime nearly now 11 years ago. So without further ado, I'll play this video and then we'll talk about it. The work that we do is we use films to tell the story of communities and empower those communities in the aftermath of hate. And the reason why that is because a lot of times the narrative of the perpetrator, the hateful person, or the person causing harm, is oftentimes centered in our media. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to tell the story of survivors and survivorship.
These were people who were walking alive just a week back. They are no more with us. We come together in love and peace and understanding rather than, hatred.
It can happen to anybody, any place, anywhere. Hatred, don't care where it goes. What hurt them also hurt us too. We're Christians. We all are brothers and sisters together. That's why we're here. came to share their grief too.
Sometimes people think that when you go to a situation like this, it's over, it's done, you go home, let's do your job, you get back. It doesn't work that way. There were some pretty graphic things that went on there. They're trained to see that, but now when one of their own goes down, we need to heal behind closed doors in a group and come together and talk and cry. I would like to see them get some time to catch their breath too.
She was a very hardworking woman.
She sacrificed what she wanted for herself to give us what we needed. Just working for 12, 14 hours a day just to put food on the table.
My dad was a strong person, a strong personality. He was gonna fight till the end. And sometimes it, rubbed people the wrong way, but he was also a very honest person, almost brutally honest. A lot of integrity. You don't know that you have these characteristics built into you until you need them.
How can we look into the eye of a horrific tragedy? I seek solace in the fact that even in death, my father has done more to promote awareness of the Sikh faith than he did when he was alive.
The whole concept of Sangat, or community in our faith, is that you as an individual cannot find truth. We must learn together to find that truth. So we're always encouraged to pray in groups, to meditate together, to interact with each other, to eat together, to serve each other, and that hope.
You never get used to coming into a scene where your dad took his last breath, murmuring, Vaheguru, Vaheguru, please come save me. My mom used to be really involved in the Gurdwara and helping out all the time.
Still, it's hard for me. Starts shaking my heart and everything.
It's a hard obstacle to try to get over.
One of the things that was most important, I believe, for the Sikh community to hear was the clear articulation that this was, in fact, a hate crime. Not because it lessened the pain, but just because it gave them the ability to say, we are a part of America. They are our doctors, there are nurses, our teachers, there are masons, there are cab drivers, they are us. There is no one to prosecute here. There's no defendant for us to indict. But that suggests that we have a larger mission, and that is, in part, education. What do you take from an experience like this?
This guy was inked up to the max with neo-Nazi, white supremacist tattoos. Hate festers like a sore. It doesn't happen overnight. I wonder how many people ran into this guy and didn't know what he was about. As a law enforcement officer, you should know your community inside now. You should get to the places that you don't normally get to. It's hard to say to someone else, don't be ignorant when you're ignorant yourself.
It's very difficult, obviously, to be up here in MC when today was the day that I found out my father was murdered. I was full of so much anger. If I do something constructive, if I try to help build community, I don't think about the negative side.
As for Wade Michael Page, there is no question that my father, and I'm pretty sure the other victim families, they've forgiven him and pray for his soul.
After they took my dad confused, I started crying. And I couldn't stop. Where's your candles, friend? Guru, look out. Guru, see there. Thank you. Thanks for your love. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. It seems like every time I get tired, somebody steps up and uplifts me, us, all of us. As much as you were angry, as much as you were going through these feelings of grief, so was the rest of this community. And the rest of the community literally took their arms, braced them around you, and took that burden of pain away.
Yes, it makes a difference.
We can laugh, we can sing together, we can beat the drum together, we can be with each other, and that creates this healing.
Small towns, small cities in America, we can accomplish things that set examples. We can make a change that's real.
Wake up all the builders, time to build a new land.
Thank you so much for going back on that journey of what happened in the aftermath of hate. As we kind of discussed in there, let's not learn about each other the first time through a tragedy, right? We need to learn about each other before that. We need to understand each other's existence, the way that we navigate. In the aftermath of that hate crime, even the day of, we saw community come together from different walks of life. We saw people who left their churches and came there. We saw people who left their masjids and synagogues, and they made a choice to show up. Today, you have all made the choice to show up and continue to show up. You're not even just showing up for yourselves, but showing up and learning about what you can do before. Lieutenant Brian Murphy, you saw him on the screen there. He was the first one to get to the scene as the shooter was leaving the Sikh temple. He engaged in a firefight with Wade Page, who was the shooter, who was the white supremacist. He lost that firefight against him. And as Wade Page approached him, he suffered 15 shots from close range. He was able to survive with the help of a Kevlar vest. His courage slowed down the shooter enough that the responding officer, who also got there, was able to engage in another fight, and Wade Page was taken down at that time. So we did not go through a trial. What we went through was the weeks and months after of what community healing needs to look like in the aftermath of hate. And we needed that to happen at such a level that what was remembered from that time was not why the shooter, what the shooter, who the shooter was, or what his motivation or manifesto read, but what the community wanted. And if that doesn't happen at each and every one of these, then the next prospective shooter that's out there that wants to cause misery and wants to gain fame is more likely to commit violence. At this point, I've not heard of one white supremacist or anybody name out the shooter and say, hey, I want to be just like Wade Michael Page. I make it a point to say his name because I want to remind white supremacists out there of just how miserably they failed. Our community continues to heal. People from across sectors come together. The police department works closely with the Sikh community of Wisconsin. We work closely with the mental health community. We work closely, with faith-based communities and other advocates. And we've been doing this work for 11 years. I saw the same children that were in there who were impacted by that communal trauma that day. They have gone on and they have become the next, they've gone on to the military. They've gone on to become nurses. They have gone on to become doctors. What communal trauma could have done was closed our doors because of fear. And in fact, the first time I walked back into the Sikh temple of Wisconsin, there were a lot of people who were suffering with that fear. And I heard lots of conversations of young folks who basically were saying in our own language, why do white people hate us? Why do they not like us? And we could have reaffirmed that and said, you know what, because of this, and this, they don't like you. But I was worried that we were going to lose the next generation and what America has always represented to me is, is compassion and love and a future forward for, first time immigrants, second generation immigrants, and for all of us to work on this American dream together. And if these kids stayed in their fear for too long, I was scared that they would not be part of that next generation and thus would not fulfill what they were supposed to fulfill in this lifetime. So over the last 11 years, that's really been our act of forgiveness. Lots of times people understand forgiveness to be forgetting, or somebody says, well, forgiveness is just to say it's okay that the harm happened to you. Forgiveness for us was very vengeful, not against the actor, but against the act of hate. And you are a continuation of that healing forgiveness. So as you go forward, as you watch this, as we kind of raise our hands and say, this is what I'm going to do in the aftermath. If ever I'm called upon to do this, I'm going to make sure that I work towards progress, right? And within that progress, it can get very, very heavy. It can get, like a lot of times we talk about self-care, we talk about all these things. I know I talk about it all the time, but sometimes I feel like I'm the last one to help myself because I feel like everybody else is worth it before I. And for me, in the aftermath of this hate, when my father was murdered, he was the president of the Sikh temple for 15 years. He was essentially our leader. And what I understood at that time was my grief had to take a back seat to the healing of the rest of the community. So in the aftermath, we did whatever we could to bring in, therapists, to bring in legal professionals to help pay for funerals, to help cover costs on rent and housing. Most of the people that lost their lives that day were the only breadwinner of their family. Many of them were just in this country for 2 to 3 years. So they didn't know their legal rights. They did not have the ability to kind of go out and find jobs. They didn't know how to write resumes. Many of them didn't have permanent status. Within the aftermath of hate, all of these conversations start to be a real conversation of what do we do? And each community is unique. And sometimes what happens is that our grief takes a back seat. And that's for all of you that are going into helping professionals. You're going into them because you're selfless. But, I want to let you know that sometimes it's okay to be selfish, to come back to yourself. It's not okay to be self-centered. Okay? There's a difference. Being selfish means you come back and you fill the vessel that you need to fill. You need to take some time away. You need to exercise. You need to have a routine. You need to have a schedule. You need to have loved ones. I think in our group, we talked a little bit about the help of equine therapy or therapy dogs. What we need is connection, right? Connection to one another. What we also need is trust, and for us to trust institutions, and that is going to take some time. That is going to take us understanding that, hey, there are some significant issues that exist, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's in the medical field, whether it's our universities. There are issues that do exist, and nobody's shying away from understanding that. What we all need to do is we become really good farmers and dig our hands into this American soil, and we all till, right? We all dig, and we all get into whatever job, whatever occupation, wherever you're going to get into, and do the best that you can to fight the inequities that exist. You're the solution. Ultimately, you're the solution to what is going on, and we will make progress as long as you remember that. So with that said, everyone, take care of yourself. We're going to go into the next breakout in just 1 second. If there's a little bit of processing that needs to happen from all of this, again, that make sure you first and foremost, not in a bad way, right? Just be selfish and take care of yourself. And thank you for the work that you all do. And thank you for having me on to talk today.
Pardeep, if I could just address one question, and that is, you talked about, how this event happened 11 years ago to you and your family and your community. And you've also talked about how you've continued to heal over the last 11 years. Can you talk to a little bit to the group about how that healing has evolved over the 11 years from day one till today? And what does that look like over that time?
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you so much for that question. And for me, it has been, I have been able to grieve, and grieving comes in different moments of your life, not sometimes when you least expect it. And for us, this was, our sort of 9/11, and I don't want to equate it to a tragedy like that, but I heard from Sikhs all over the world. I heard from Sikhs in Australia, in India, in London, and they were like, "What is going on?" I saw people who were burning U.S. flags in parts of the world. And so I understood the impact that this had on the broader sort of diaspora of Sikhs. And that's been sort of like the work over time, is to kind of like we wanted to address what happened to our particular smaller community, but we knew that we had a larger call with that. I would say, 10 years after the shooting happened, my daughter, who was 6 at the time, and the only reason we were not inside the shooting, my mom survived, my dad was killed. We were not inside the shooting because my daughter forgot a notebook at the house, and we were about 10 minutes late. So she was 6 at that time. When she was 16, she came up to me and said, and she's a brilliant spoken word artist, a poet, she's a great reader and a writer. And she tells me, "Dad, I want to read a spoken word that I wrote to the shooter in our situation." She wrote it to the shooter, right? And I think all of us want to think that we're doing good jobs as parents, but I was scared because my initial sort of understanding was all of those kids being terrorized by white supremacist terrorists who set out to do the exact thing of being in their fear. And here she is 10 years later saying, "I want to do a spoken word at the biggest event that Sikhs were going to have." She did it. She came out, and her last words on her spoken word was, and she looked directly into, obviously the camera was there at the time. She didn't read off of anything. She had it known by heart, but she said, "You didn't hate me. You hated yourself." And that let the weight off all of us as we think about the next generation of what we don't want this hate to do is make you hate yourself. People are hurting out there in the world, and we need leaders who are healers. And that's all of you. The work that you all do and it's hard work. It's not easy work. If you want to know, it's easy to jump on a side and say, "Well, I'm for this side or that side." A healer steps in the middle and holds space for everybody, right? That's not easy work to do. So, Johnathan, thank you so much for the question.
Well, and Pardeep, thank you so much. Unfortunately, some people had to go to class, but we will continue on. We're going to do a quick breakout session. And if there are few people in your breakout room, move yourself to another room to join in with your colleagues and classmates. And we're going to talk about what personal and professional supports you'd like to see in your school and workplace and community. And along with what you said, Pardeep, how are you showing up for yourself and others, and reflect on the way you can take care of yourself. So let's see how these breakouts pan out, and see you on the other side. Hi, everybody. I think that, I'm a little sad that we don't have as many people. I understand people had to get back to class, and that's always a problem. But that said, we had some really interesting discussion. One of the things that Dr. Paul Siegel was talking about was the power of the gun lobby. And we discussed, well, why don't we have an alternative lobby that is equally powerful, that is about, advocating for, not a black and white view, because that's what we do right now. It's, we're black and white about everything, but really urgency to better society, to take care of one another, to get back to that space. I know, Emily, you had I know you had a question early on, and I'd like to put that out there. Not Emily Dornblaser, Emily Wagner. But while I'm looking for it, what would other people hear?
Can anyone address Rashida's question about third spaces?
So Rashida said, what are the panelists' thoughts on the protection and investment into third spaces into our community to foster positive connections and prevent violence? So I'm looking at our panel. Would you like to respond to that?
Rashida, give me a little bit more clarity. I don't know what you mean by third spaces. I apologize. I've not heard it referred to that quite that way before. What specifically are you referring to?
Can we unmute Rashida, please?
Rashida will have to be made a co-host in order to be unmuted.
I think I'll take I think Rashida's talking maybe about just places that people kind of organically gather, kind of like coffee shops or union type of areas.
Oh, safe spaces.
Sure.
I know that here on the grounds of the University of Virginia in our student building, we have multiple spaces, some of which are unique to interests, religious orientation, multicultural center. All of those spaces are specifically designed in part for that purpose. It's a safe space where people can go and have discussions around issues, particularly in the world that we're in today. We have student organizations that have been impacted by the war on both sides of that interaction. And there are spaces within our student union, multicultural spaces for each of those groups. And there's the collective multicultural space as well. I consider them to be the kind of spaces I think you're referring to. I certainly consider them to be safe spaces, and spaces where people are free to go and have difficult discussions over issues that will oftentimes in other environments and in other spaces create conflict. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, Rashida, but if it is, I fully support that both in concept and in investment, particularly if whether it be public space or in a university environment.
Pardeep, do you want to? Thank you, Tim. Pardeep, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with the chief. I think that we need to invest in these places as well. There's a lot of places where, I think some of these safe spaces may be getting weaponized, and I think kind of attacking the fabric of where people would want to gather. So I agree with the chief. I think that we just need to make sure that we're protecting those spaces. Yeah.
Other folks in your rooms, anything that came out, anything that you want to bring forward that you heard? I know it's been a powerful day of listening and hard stories and others. I see Kylie. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think speaking to the gun issue, gun violence, and how that's affecting communities. When we think about sometimes some of the biggest issues facing us, right? Identity motivated reasoning and habituation. And habituation basically can be just kind of, we have been simmering in the soup so long that we don't know it's insane, right? We don't know the amount of gun violence that's happening right now is just insane. And we need to go back and really, like as students are saying, we need to look at the First Amendment, Second Amendments, and I'm all for the constitutional protection of these rights. But when we think about them, we think about the First Amendment and when freedom of speech and press and all of that, we had communication that took a while for it to get from one place to the other, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Second Amendment, we had protections that we had guns that kind of, it was difficult to load. It took you nearly 30 seconds to a minute to load and shoot accurately. Today's day and age, you have weapons of mass destruction and also media of mass rejection, fueling one another, and the amplification of violence is escalating at such a high rate because of a lot of that and underlying issues of mental health and stress and all these other things that we really need to have some sincere discussions about how that moves forward. And you all are right of like, I'm not a political person, but the administration right now has started one of like the first of its kind of organizations that are looking at gun violence, right? A presidential initiative has been is being undertaken right now. So as it goes forward, keep pushing for those policy things, keep advocating the way that you all know how to advocate for a safer society. At some point, we do need to defuel the kind of the firepower that exists to get to a safer society generally. Right?
Yes, and I think beyond that, and you use this terminology, Pardeep, is we've become a very disconnected society where relationship and connection are diminished, and where we are divided. And I think we have to reestablish those safe spaces, those third spaces, those places where we can honestly connect, where we become human beings to one another, where we get to know, I think Emily Dornblaser group said, be your own true self with each other. And I think that's incredibly important. So my goodness, I wish we could go on, but it is time to end. I want to very much thank our panelists so much for being here, and let's continue this conversation at another time and in another space. And just to remind everybody, thank you, Sarah, for the look, we have applause. This is great. Thank you, everybody. To remind you that next week we have another very controversial subject, an important subject to talk about, which is harm reduction in healthcare settings. And we'll be working with folks from Maine Health to have that conversation. So thank you all, and we'll see you the next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.